I want to talk about the emotional benefits of growing older at work. Now, if people think about aging, most often they think about the negative changes. I like to ask that question with my students. I ask them, quickly, what do you associate when you hear the word aging? And then they usually come up with, I'm getting slower, or people aren't as cognitively sharp, all these kind of things. So usually when we think of aging, we think of the negative changes. However, that's not the complete picture. And in fact, it's not a very accurate picture of what aging means, because there is a number of very positive changes. And especially in the emotional realm, we see some positive changes. Now, in fact, when you talk with older workers about their experiences of aging at work, you can hear some remarkably positive stories. I usually ask my master students to first interview a few older workers so they get a sense of the topic. And so, for example, one student came back, she interviewed some nurses, and then she hears stories like, when I was really young and I just started in my job, and a patient would die, I would really take that home and it would affect me for days in a row. Whereas nowadays, I go home from work and I switch off, and that's it. I'm feeling good. Or I liked a story by another master student. He wanted to do some research with police officers, so he did some interviews and asked them, how do they deal with highly negatively arousing situations at their work? So they are on a shift and they encounter like a shooting or some aggressive civilians. And the older police officers would say, well, when I was young, it was kind of challenging, but nowadays I know pretty well what I have to do to calm them down and to calm myself down and stay effective. And the young police officers, interestingly, said, I actually rather go on a shift with an older colleague than a younger colleague, because then I'm much more relaxed and things don't get out of, don't develop into a crisis situations. So these types of stories suggest that as people get older, they may get better at navigating the emotional demands of their job and stay well and effective. So in other words, they may develop some emotional competencies. Now, emotional competencies are individual differences in knowledge, skills, and abilities to effectively deal with own and other people's emotions. And usually researchers distinguish different kinds of emotional competencies. So for example, the competency to perceive emotions, to know what someone else is feeling or know what I myself are feeling. The competency to understand emotions, so in other words, to know how emotions arise and in what types of situations, and especially how they affect our behavior later on. And regulating emotions, so knowing what to do, what kind of thoughts would be helpful in order to change our own emotions. And these competencies also build on each other. If we're very good at reading emotional cues in other people, and we know, how emotions develop over time, then we are also better able to regulate emotions. Now, why would emotional competencies get better with age? There is a number of explanations or mechanisms that researchers have explored in order to understand that phenomenon. And one reason why emotional competencies should get better with age is this very simple experience. So, or what we also call crystallized cognition as compared to more fluid forms of cognition. So, in other words, as we grow older, we encounter a number of emotional situations maybe in our daily work life. We learn what works for us. We learn how things develop emotionally over time, to read cues in others and so forth. So experience may help us to get better. Another interesting explanation is motivation. Well, in fact, as we grow older, we start to realize that we won't live forever. That's pretty true, I guess. And also in our work, we realize that we have only so many more years left at work. And so we have a change in our time perspective. And that will affect people's goals and people's motivation. And it turns out, and there's some pretty good evidence, that as people have a more restricted time perspective, they start to focus more on the moment, and they tend to savor positive experiences more in the moment, and try to avoid negative emotions around them. So that may also explain why they get better emotionally with age. And then, paradoxically, physiology may help us. So that is a case where we would expect negative changes with age. In particular, it has been shown that the physiological flexibility is reduced as people get older. But, well, paradoxically, that may help us to not react as strongly to negatively arousing situations. So there may be less arousal, and that makes it easier to still stay calm and focused and regulate our emotions. Well, I have to say, in some situations when arousal becomes really high, then it can backfire, because then reduced physiological flexibility can also mean that it takes longer for older systems to get back to baseline. But luckily, in most of our daily work life, we don't experience really high negative arousing situations, so older people can do pretty well. Now, I want to show you some evidence from a recent study where we see indeed a pattern of or suggesting improvements in emotional competencies with age, in particular in emotion regulation. So that is a study that, a diary study that we did with healthcare workers. So we had a sample of younger and older physicians and pharmacists and physiotherapists, and like all kinds of occupations that are working in healthcare. And we gave them some scenarios of situations that would make them feel emotional, and asked them how they would respond. They had different options. And these responses would correspond to different possible emotion regulation strategies. So for example, and we grouped actually the different responses into sets of adaptive and maladaptive emotion regulation strategy that was based on prior literature, and we also confirmed this grouping with psychotherapist experts who rank ordered our responses. So for example, in a negative situation, like your patient has just passed away, in order to not feel as negative for yourself, you could use strategies such as positive reappraisal, emotion sharing, distracting yourself, or if you can, try to do something about the situation. When it concerns positive emotions, also very important, how can we ensure that our positive emotions last and maybe last longer? People can use strategies such as savoring, kind of being appreciative of what they have, expressing positive emotions to others, and so forth. And, but you also can react in what we would consider a more maladaptive way, based on prior research showing that this is linked to negative mental health outcomes, for example. So you could ruminate, right? So your patient has died, and you think about, you know, did you do something wrong, and why did I end up in that job in the first place where I only see suffering around me, and then it could just occupy your thoughts for forever, or other types of strategies. Now, turned out that age predicted which responses people endorsed. So we found evidence that the older healthcare workers would endorse more often or more of these adaptive strategies, and fewer of those maladaptive strategies. And then in the next step, we try to link age differences in emotion regulation strategy endorsement with well-being. So that was a diary study where we sampled emotional experience at the end of the workday, when work is done. And we just asked people across 10 days, so how are you feeling? You know, how sad are you? How happy are you? How relaxed or exhausted, and so forth. And we grouped the emotional experience according to the circumplex model into high and low arousal, positive and negative emotions. Well, it turns out that, that our strategies were predictive of people's actual emotional experience at the end of the workday. So, for example, we found that older people said they would use more adaptive strategies, and indeed these would predict more positive emotional experience at the end of a workday. Now, that is one recent piece of evidence. It's not the only one. And in fact, Friederike Durwald, our PhD student, has recently conducted a systematic literature review on the current state of knowledge about emotional competencies and age trajectories. And she identified almost 200 studies, and we distinguished different emotional subcompetencies, 9 in total. And indeed, we found for 4 of the 9 emotional subcompetencies, and that included some aspects of emotion regulation and emotional understanding, we found a positive trajectory. So there was evidence for positive change across these studies. Now, admittedly, we also found some other age trajectories for some other competencies, but you can see the predominant picture was indeed positive. What we also noted is, by the way, that we have much less research for middle-aged adults. So usually studies compare young and older, but leave out the middle. Well, these are the older workers that we care about, so we are planning to do way more research on that age group. Okay, now, why is that important to look at emotional competencies, especially in work contexts. And in fact, it turns out, and there's a lot of research on the influence of emotions and emotional competencies on work outcomes. And it turns out that these are key drivers of behaviors and work-related attitudes that organizations care about and that determine our well-being. So there may be some very important individual level benefits of improved emotional competencies, like strain and well-being. Older people may have advantages. Or task performance. Well, if you're emotionally challenged, I think we all can relate, like it really captures our thoughts and we cannot really focus well on the work task that we are doing. So if you're better at regulating emotions, well, then you probably are better at keeping up your performance, even if emotionally challenged. But even beyond individuals, we can have we can expect some positive outcomes of improved emotional competencies with age for the team and also for the organizational level. Things like group affect, how the group feels. Maybe good to have older team members around. Organizational citizenship behavior we know is driven by emotional competencies. Things like mentoring, and Friederike has a poster on that, and leadership. All of these may be promising contexts to show benefits with age and interesting ways how older workers can contribute to the effectiveness of organizations beyond maybe the more traditional ways. Okay, so to conclude, growing older may have some important emotional benefits that help older workers stay well and effective at work when emotionally challenged. And I think this is it's very important to pay more attention to these positive changes, to understand them better, because currently what we see in research on the aging worker is a predominantly negative focus. So a focus on the negative changes, on ways to compensate for negative changes with age. But that's not the whole picture. And I think we do need a more balanced picture where we highlight the negative and the positive changes that come with age. Thank you.